So, thank you so much for coming. I'm really looking forward to this evening because we have got two fascinating speakers. On my left, Krishnendhu Mukherjee, who was a colleague of mine in Chambers in London. He's an
as your trainee.
He is now a very distinguished lawyer, specialising in immigration law when he's in the UK, and in environmental law when he's in India, which is half the time. And so I think we're going to learn an awful lot from him about the effects of climate change, particularly in and around the Bay of Bengal, I think, where he's been working with communities that are affected. On my right, Claire Shakya, who probably needs no introduction. Certainly, a lot of us here know her. We're very lucky to have her here in Charlbury. She is the head of climate change research at the International Institute for Environment and Development. And she has 25 years experience looking at issues of environmental degradation, climate change, and the impact on the poor world, the global south, with lots of experience in Africa, Latin America, and South Asia. And she's been involved in the climate change negotiations and advising government on what is necessary in terms of trying to do justice to those communities who are the most affected and the least responsible for climate change. So really we could not have a better qualified panel, which makes it absolutely shocking that I'm only going to give them 10 minutes each in the first instance to set out an initial presentation, and then I'm going to ask them some questions just to tease out some of the issues that I think I'm interested in anyway, and hopefully you are, and then we'll open it up to the floor. Okay, thank you very much. I think we're going to have to move. Okay, I'll come this side.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for the invitation. When people think about climate change, they think of things like sea level rise and glacial melt, and so on. And I just wanted to share some of the silent effects, in a way, because they're not as publicized, but the silent effects that I've seen working as an advocate in India for the past 13 years. So you're probably all aware of the Sundarbans, the largest mangrove forest in the world, a big carbon sink, home of the Royal Bengal tiger, straddles both India and Bangladesh. And my family come from Calcutta originally, so I'm fairly familiar with this region. And in 2008, when I was working in Delhi, I travelled to the Sundarbans to look at some of the renewable energy projects, but investigated a phenomena which had just recently been publicised in some of the English national papers at that time. Next slide, please. And these photos were taken by a local photojournalist in Calcutta, a guy called Shakti Pal, when he visited the island communities in the Indian Sundarbans a few years ago. And I put the caption there because you can see these people obviously scurrying away from coming in. Where do you go when you lose your home and livelihood? Next slide, please. And when it's caused by climate change, who bears the responsibility providing you accommodation and jobs? And that's obviously, as a lawyer, in terms of liability, in terms of remedy, that's something that really engages us as a legal community. Next slide, please. Next. So those questions have been facing the Sundarban Islanders who've lost land due to sea level rise. Now, obviously, we know that sea level rises anyway, but in a study done by Charlbury University over a 7-year period, Charlbury University is a university in Calcutta where Amartya Sen graduated from, you know, the Nobel Prize economist. They did a study and found that the sea level rise was caused by the warming of the sea, but also by the melting of the glaciers which fed the Ganges and other rivers, and that was the cause of increased erosion of the island communities. When I went there in 2008, I was told that 600 families who were displaced by erosion of mainly 2 islands in the Indian Sundarban archipelago, Lower Chora and Goramora Island, had been rehoused on Sagar Island. I went there and I found colonies of possibly the first environmental refugees to climate change there. I interviewed them, and all of that is contained in an essay which is on the net, which is published by the IUCN. But I found that many had lost quite considerable land which had been in their family for quite some time. And I found that many of those who were then rehoused on Sagar Island, given somewhere to live on Sagar Island, which is the main island, then had to move to southern India to find work. So they could no longer do their fishing and so on, or their agriculture, and then therefore had to move out of the area completely, in fact out of West Bengal, eastern India, and move to southern India for work. And this next, yeah, and this is a continuous phenomena that is taking place in both the Indian Sundarbans and the Bangladesh Sundarbans, and it was predicted in the study done by Professor Hazra in 2008 that by 2020, 100,000 people would be displaced by land erosion caused by anthropogenic climate change, by sea level rise. I went there 3 weeks ago and was told that the phenomena is increasing, land erosion, that there are more people who are being displaced and seeking to be rehoused on Sagar Island. So there'll be a continuing number of people who are looking for some form of home, some form of livelihood as this phenomenon increases. Next slide. This seems unrelated to climate change when you first look at it. A scourge of silicosis among migrant workers. We have this young man, Kalu Ram, he's age 19, he has silicosis, and for those who don't know, silicosis is a disease which you get if you breathe in small particles of silica dust, sandstone, and so on. This man is a temple carver, and his entire family have silicosis. His brother died of silicosis, and the rest of his brothers also died of silicosis, and they all have been working as temple carvers in this village. And this village is, next slide please, and this village is in a place where I've also worked, Pindwara village in the Sahori district of Rajasthan. And in a recent screening of that village of temple carvers, it was found that 35% of workers screened by the authorities were diagnosed with silicosis, a very high prevalence of silicosis among the population. And that the traditional temple carvers, the communities that temple carve, when I say temple carvers, you know what I mean, there's sort of statues and deities and so on, which you'll find, in fact, one of the major purchasers of these temple carves is the Swaminarayan movement, which have a big temple in Neasden in northwest London, if you know. So these are export-orientated industries. But most of the present workers, temple carvers, are from tribal and Dalit groups who are from southern Rajasthan, but who have migrated to centers of temple carving in order to do that. And why have they migrated? Because it appears, according to a study of rainfall patterns and so on in southern Rajasthan, that because of deforestation, because of lack of aquifers, there have been a change in the rainfall patterns, and therefore these traditional horticulturalists have been forced to give up horticulture and move to places like this where they're working in unsafe conditions and contracting occupational diseases like silicosis. So, next, yeah. So, my experience indicates that obviously climate change presents issues of both internal and international, transnational migration. And how do we solve that problem? So, India, as a country which may be thought to be, first of all, one of the countries most affected by climate change. I think it's number one in terms of the countries most affected by climate change. You have obviously a number of cities, mega cities, which are coastal, Calcutta, Mumbai, Chennai, which are all going to be affected by sea level rise and so on. But also affected by surrounding countries like Bangladesh. Bangladesh, obviously, as we know, is one of the countries that's going to be most affected by sea level rise. India is not a signatory to the 1951 Refugee Convention, but it does grant refugee status on a discretionary basis after an assessment by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. But recent moves in India indicate that even that form of the granting of refugee status is going to be prejudiced, it's going to be discriminatory. Many of you may have read in the papers about the Indian Citizenship Act amendment. And as part of that, what the government are trying to do is to set up a national register of citizens in an Indian state of Assam, which borders Bangladesh, in order to identify illegal Bangladeshis. And the present government, the president of the present ruling party, Amit Shah, referred to illegal Bangladeshis as termites and said that all illegal Bangladeshis nationals should be expelled. And so the moves, the populist moves by India will mean that it'll be almost impossible for Muslims who are, let's say, victims of climate change from Bangladesh to get protection in India unless the present regime changes. And in fact, when I was in Calcutta a few months ago, I visited a prison, because I also write expert reports about prison conditions in India, and I visited a prison in India and found that many of the inmates were Rohingya refugees from Burma, but also with a connection to Bangladesh, that originate in Bangladesh. So, this is at present how the Indian authorities can treat refugees. Yeah. So, the climate crisis will see increasing numbers of people migrating, especially in the global south. The injustice, obviously, about the whole climate change scenario is those who have contributed the least to global warming will be the most affected by global warming. That will be aggravated by more, I think, probably more, if the present situation continues, more draconian immigration laws, with governments determined to pursue populist agendas. And so, because we know this is happening already, so it's not like, the effects of climate change, and I do get very irritated when people say, climate change, the effects of climate change are going to happen. They're already happening in places like the Sundarbans, in places like Rajasthan. We'll need a multilateral movement, a multilateral discourse, in order to see that the climate change refugees, climate change migrants, both internal and external, get the same kind of humanitarian response as climate change mitigation, adaptation, and people who are persecuted under the Refugee Convention. And so that's that. And so, I mean, I would say that our job as lawyers, especially lawyers working in the Global South, are to raise these issues, to give these scenarios in order to publicize these, and to do strategic litigation in order to put pressure on domestic governments and international governments to implement this kind of reform. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Krishnendhu. It's given us a lot to think about. Claire, so, solutions?
There's in the climate negotiations, there's an area of work that's called loss and damage, and it's basically about the limits of adaptation. And I suppose in many ways, this is where migration happens. But climate change is what we call a wicked problem. It's highly complex, and the impacts of climate change interact with other forms of vulnerability. So it differs very much from village to village and from country to country, and it's very hard to say this is a solution that's going to work everywhere. You've really got to build systems of institutions at national and local level that can respond to a very rapidly changing context. And that isn't what we've generally been doing in the development world. When we've been supporting the poorest countries, we've tended to come with very clever ideas and sort of magic solutions that are meant to solve the problem, and not really understanding that actually this is complex and requires adjusting and agile institutions that can actually respond to very rapidly changing contexts. And for many of the countries that we work with, so I work with the least developed countries, so 47 of the poorest countries in the world, climate change is already visible. So this isn't tomorrow's problem. This isn't a problem of 5 or 10 years or my grandchildren's problem. This is today's problem. We work with low-lying atoll islands, and Bangladesh indeed is one of them. We work with mountain countries like Nepal or Bhutan. And 33 of the poorest countries are in fact in Africa. And the sorts of impacts that they're seeing are not unusual, they occurred before, but it's the frequency and the intensity that is increasing. So I think that what you were talking about, the sort of impacts that they're seeing in Bangladesh, is what we hear about all the time as well from our group. Climate change is a wicked problem. In development, the approach has tended to be to come up with a clever solution, a new rice variety or a new vaccine, and try and get it out, and expecting that that will solve the problems of the poorest countries. The problem with climate change is it's not so predictable, and it varies hugely from place to place. So what you actually need to do is to build institutions that are agile and able to respond. Now, most of the work that's happened on climate change has been about national planning, and sort of planning for an unpredictable future isn't really what they've done. They've more been saying, well, the models are saying this, they're saying that. Let's work out what the average is and plan for that. But actually what you need to be planning for is a range and managing that uncertainty across that range. Because what we're seeing in our country, so we work in IID with the 47 poorest countries, the least developed countries, the LDCs, that's the acronym, so I'm going to use it. I hope you'll remember it. So with the LDCs, basically what they're saying is we are already experiencing climate change. Climate change is happening to us today. It's not tomorrow's problem, it's today's problem. The impacts are not unusual. We have seen droughts of this nature before. We've seen flooding of this nature before. We've seen storm surges and heat waves of this nature before, but they're now happening so frequently, people don't have time to recover. So that is driving, and that it's the interaction between the climate impacts and the underlying drivers of vulnerability in those countries. And the clever solutions that the development world, myself included, love to come up with and then try and push them out isn't the answer. We have to work with building institutions. So the equivalent would be saying it's no good if the government in Whitehall has all the solutions, unless Charlbury Town Council can start thinking through with this community how to respond. It's going to be the wrong solution for Charlbury. So that's the dilemma. The level of capability at that local level is very limited in most of the countries we're working in. There are exceptions. But because we've been framing the problem wrong for so long, we haven't started doing the right things. So we've really got to change from business as usual to what we're calling business unusual. It's not very clever, but there you go. But we're trying to really think through what business unusual looks like, all the way from how development provision is given to the poorest countries, how climate finance arrives, and how it supports the capabilities at the institutional level, not just the individual level, and not just a few solutions. Mobility has always been a development response. So we've seen people moving, and South Asia must be one of the most mobile regions of the world. It's always been a solution to a development shock. So if you're poor in Bangladesh, you will be moving quite frequently. Probably it's the man that goes out, a young man probably, goes out, finds a job, sends some money back, comes back at the end of the season, and then maybe finds a better job and stays there, and then the rest of the family follow them. So mobility has been happening for generations. And countries like Nepal, for example, have actually exported their young, and that's now their main source of finance. It's not development aid, it's not investment, it's the remittances coming back from their young men that have gone out and found jobs in the Middle East. So mobility shouldn't be seen as a problem, it should be seen as part of the solution. And actually, a family that's mobile may be moving to a location where they can thrive, whereas where they come from is no longer a location they can thrive. But that is also not really seen as a development solution that's acceptable. Now, it's not so much the developing, the aid providers, the donors that worry about mobility, it's actually the countries themselves. They don't want young men coming into cities. They don't want young men all congregating somewhere, because that's when you begin to see unrest. So there's a huge pressure to keep young men in the countryside, underemployed or unemployed, in places where they're no longer thriving. So that's part of the narrative that we need to change, and we need to change it rapidly. If you look at patterns of settlement, you find that it's the places that are the most vulnerable, have always traditionally, even before we were seeing the impacts at the level we are now, that we're seeing the most climate impacts. That's where you see the poorest people. So you were talking about the chores and the horrors of Bangladesh. It's the people living outside the embankment. So the government of Bangladesh has been building embankments around, and so has India, been building embankments around to protect certain locations from flooding. It's the people living outside that are poorest. So you always find the poorest and the most vulnerable in the places that were already suffering the most climate variability, and now we're seeing that variability increase, and we're seeing it increase very rapidly. So all of a sudden, we have, in the least developed countries, we have a lot of low-lying atolls like the Solomon Islands or Vanuatu, or in the coastal areas of Bangladesh, because of sea level surge, more storms, more intense cyclones, but also just the natural high tides coming higher and coming in for longer, you're seeing more salinity in the groundwater. And we're suddenly finding out that salinity in the groundwater, well, we always knew that wouldn't be a good thing for crops, it couldn't be good for people, but now we're finding that actually it's causing all sorts of health problems that we just had no understanding of before. So we're seeing women having losing their babies, basically, and all sorts of other issues happening. So when the poorest countries are saying, we need to sort out loss and damage, this is what they're talking about. That's what they mean by loss and damage. But loss and damage is seen as an issue of compensation. So the richest countries, the UK, other industrialised nations, don't want loss and damage to be in the climate negotiations, and it's been a huge fight. And in Paris, it was one of the biggest successes that there is a line, very short sentence, but it says loss and damage. And that was seen as one of the biggest successes. And we're now in the process of trying to negotiate what does it mean to respond to loss and damage? Is it the same as adapting to climate change? Does it need to be something else? And I suppose basically what I will try and draw to a close, because I had to say most things twice, so I've probably gone over my time. But what we're trying to understand at the moment is what the package of interventions, most sensible interventions that will enable that institutional agility to emerge at the local level, at regional levels, at national levels, and at landscape level in the countries that are most affected. What types of things can you do that really makes a difference, and that isn't just an NGO coming and doing a really brilliant project, but it's only reaching 30 households or 100 households. We have to do things that are going to reach entire nations, and we have to do them quickly. And we have ideas about what those packages might look like, but what's not on the table at the moment, and what we really need to move very quickly on the table, is saying, okay, if this is what we need to, so we haven't defined the package of interventions for adaptation, which we need to do. But we also need to define a package of interventions around this issue of loss and damage. If there is a limit to how far you can adapt in that location, how are you supported to move? And what are the best ways of supporting a household that is in a place that isn't going to work, or reliant on a livelihood that is no longer a viable livelihood? How do you support them into new forms of employment or into new locations in ways that gives them dignity?
The first question I wanted to ask you is about to both of you, what do you think are the main priorities for the communities most affected by climate change? If that makes sense. Does it make sense?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, in the scenarios that I've given, people, in my experience in countries like India, don't move unless they absolutely have to because of the expenses and which the costs. I work in an area which has 1 million tons of asbestos fibre, and people don't move from there because they simply don't have the money to move from there. So it's only when things become desperate do people feel that they have to move. And in these two scenarios, there is desperation. First of all, because your island is being eroded, and secondly, because you no longer have a viable source of livelihood, which pushes you to try and find something else. So the immediate, obviously, thing is to provide some form of local livelihood, some form of way in which people can feed their families in a safe manner. There's no use people moving to work in an industry that means that they die at the age of 25 or 30, because then you've lost the breadwinner. So there's absolutely no point in doing that. So I think you can't really talk about, I think, climate change needs unless you talk about land distribution, unless you talk about safe work, unless you talk about proper remunerative work. All of these things are part of the same scenario about trying to adapt to climate change.
Oh, well, it's very hard to be short on that particular topic because it's kind of what we're working on at the moment. We have one phrase that we're using a lot, which is money where it matters. It's instead of having all the finance sitting at the national level, getting more flexible finance down to the local level where communities can make decisions themselves about what their priorities are. But that requires devolving governance. It requires giving authority to make decisions at that local level, to choose how you're going to manage your landscape or how you might move. And one of the ideas of this is you can do it both through the bottom-up governance processes. So that, we have local governments making plans, and the central government give them a fiscal transfer. They spend the money. So you add money to that is just for climate action, and you encourage the communities to plan around that and make their choices. But that then begins to shift how the main development budget, the main budget of the government, is spent. There's another way is giving it to the poorest households through welfare systems, social protection, and another way is supporting enterprise, which governments generally do already. But thinking about how that might support people into new forms of livelihood or into new locations requires different ways of doing it. So in the Caribbean, for example, they have something called reciprocal social protection. So if you have the right to some form of welfare support in one island, you have the right to move to another island and get an equivalent level of welfare support in that island. So basically you're able to move, and that we don't have anywhere else in the world. And if we began to support those types of systems, that would help people. If we began to think about what types of enterprise would be relevant in different locations for young people, build their skills, give them scholarships, help them become the pathfinders for households when they're looking, because that's traditionally always the way it's been. It's the young men going out, finding work. Well, let's skill them up and give them opportunities, give them stipends or little grants to start new businesses that can take them to new locations or to new forms of livelihood. And Back in the day, post-industrialisation in the UK, one of the answers was to set up new towns. Well, we need to be thinking in those terms as well. New towns or new forms of agriculture, more intensive agriculture maybe, that needs workers, that creates jobs and creates opportunity for people to move into places where you can thrive. But there's also an issue around where the innovation happens. So often technologies are being innovated in little sheds around Britain, actually. Most of the innovation happens in different ways in different countries, but apparently it's a shed-driven innovation world in the UK. But that process is fine if they're coming up with the right solutions for the challenges that the South are facing, and often it's not. So how can we bring innovation ecosystems to the South so that we're really supporting them coming up with their new solutions? And then finally, it's about rights, and the rights of a migrant, and I'm sure you'll be more expert, both of you, than I will ever be on this subject, but about recognising that actually everybody has a right to move with dignity. And this is one of the biggest things for our least developed countries, is they're saying when we're refugees, we're treated like dirt. But actually, the reason we're moving is all of your fault. So we need a different way of organising this. So we're being welcomed in and being offered land or being offered new places. And particularly for those countries where the entire country is going under the sea, they need to be offered locations for them to go and actually continue their cultural processes and their cultural integrity in a new location. So how do we negotiate that?
Just to follow up on that, you talked about the success in Paris of getting in this line about loss and damage. Was there any discussion then or since about resettlement rights?
The issue for the UNFCCC, which is the climate talks, is that their remit is limited by the roles of other parts of the UN system. So anything that relates to refugee rights gets sort of pushed out to be dealt with by UNHCR and other bodies of the UN. So the mandate of the UNFCCC is limited by what is specific to climate. However, this is part of what needs to be resolved. So within the only way we're going to resolve the loss and damage debate is to start to resolve these types of issues. The problem at the moment is that even the countries we advise, we haven't managed to make them help them move on from one single thing that they keep asking for, which is compensation. And that is a debate that we're not going to solve in climate negotiations. That will be resolved within courts. So if they could start asking more for things that they could actually get the UN responding to, we might begin to resolve this. But it's a highly political, you can imagine, it's highly emotional for a lot of these countries.
Right, thank you. I was going to slightly change the subject and ask about the relationship, if there is one, the extent to which climate change and environmental degradation are related. And I was thinking specifically of the case of the 39 Vietnamese refugees who it turned out were all from this area of Vietnam where the coastline had been completely devastated for about 200 miles and people's livelihoods as fishermen completely destroyed by a chemical spill in a steel works. So, I mean, we know obviously about fossil fuels and climate change, but are these things, because it was obviously this chemical spill that then caused mass migration from this area of Vietnam. So how are they related, or are they just separate sort of catastrophes that are going on simultaneously?
You can't artificially compartmentalize climate change to environmental degradation to breaches of fundamental human rights. A breach of environmental degradation is a breach, and is being recognized more so as a breach of people's absolute fundamental human rights. And to say there's a human rights discourse and an environment discourse is an artificial distinction. Environmental degradation, climate change are fundamental human rights issues. And you can see that, I think, in all of these scenarios where, like the dewdrop on a leaf, it reflects the world around it. So in the Sundarbans example, you have a situation where the mangrove forest has been degraded. A huge aquifer like the Amazon, a huge carbon sink like the Amazon has been degraded because of uncontrolled population, because of industry and so on, which has led to the increasing erosion of the islands. And the solution to that is to repopulate those islands with mangroves, at least a sort of short-term to medium-term solution. Similarly, the workers, the migrant workers that move from southern Rajasthan into these unsafe conditions where they contract silicosis, the reason why they've moved is because the area where they live, the Aravalli Hills, has been deforested, and that has led to a lack of aquifers, and their ground is no longer arable, and they can no longer survive as horticulturists. So yes, I mean, these are absolutely fundamental environmental problems, and I think there's a really a pressing need really to not talk about climate change simply as climate change, but talk about climate change in terms of human rights, because surprise, surprise, the areas which have the worst human rights violations are also the place which has the worst environmental degradation as well. So in the sandstone industry in Rajasthan, where I'm a trustee of a mine workers charity, huge environmental degradation, but also bonded labour, child labour, large amounts of unreported sexual harassment, silicosis, and so on. And so, how do you get people to campaign for a better environment? You also have to tackle these other issues as well, because people won't think about their environment unless they are empowered, and they only get empowered when they talk about fundamental things that affect them.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, inequality, poverty are intrinsically linked to environmental degradation and climate change. And okay, a chemical spill and climate change is an obvious link. But you're right, in many places, it's those communities that have deepest poverty, are most chronically poor, most unable to access or influence their governments, that where you're finding environmental degradation is massive, and the impacts of climate change are therefore much more severe because they're already so vulnerable. And there's interesting, I mean, in Brazil, for example, they prior to Bolsonaro, they had some very strong legal protections of communities, so that when a corporate in any way damaged the environment in that location, the compensation was really quite considerable to those communities. Now, the impact of that was the communities set up trust funds. They set up their own funding arrangement with revolving funds supporting the communities in those locations. And those communities became empowered, and they began to negotiate with the government about how development investments happened in that location. And they really changed the nature of their rights and their access to resources and the way development happened, not to them, but with them around their priorities. So there's an opportunity actually for compensation from those types of moments where a corporate needs to compensate the community to really change the power dynamics in that location.
I was going to ask about corporate accountability. What mechanisms are there, sort of internationally? Are there any mechanisms? I mean, we hear all about the WTO rules, and all that seems to involve is corporations having the power to sue governments for, NHS or, nationalisation programs or whatever for any loss of profit. Does it work the other way around? What sort of accountability is there on an international level for sort of things like deforestation? Because from what I can see, certainly now in Brazil in particular, there seems to be pretty much impunity there.
The act in Brazil that required corporates to pay compensation to communities still exists, and the institute that used to oversee that still exists, but whether or not whether it has any teeth left under Bolsonaro, I don't know. I think the issue, this is not, again, an area that I'm working on, or particularly I'm not a lawyer, and colleagues of mine who are investigating at the moment, is the dispute resolution process around trade rules. So the reality is, if a country says we want to go to net zero and we don't want any bad industry coming in, we don't want oil and gas exploration or processing, we don't want any heavy industry that is high carbon, we don't want anything that will take us off our path of going to net zero, there's very little they can do, because under the trade agreements that they already have with the rest of the world, investment agreements they have with the rest of the world, actually requires them to be able to, it allows an investor to come in to invest in something under the agreement previously, and the dispute resolution system basically favours the corporates and not the government. So at the moment there's a huge imbalance, and at some point in the next 6 months, very clever legal colleagues of mine will have worked it all out, and we'll have a big piece on this. And I'll be able to tell you all about it. At the moment, all I know is really bad news.
I used to describe trying to get corporate accountability in India as like grabbing a snowflake and putting it into a fridge before it melted in the Indian summer. It was like an almost unremittingly difficult task. The major problem about corporate accountability, especially in countries in the global south, is access to justice, and you're faced with so many barriers. And obviously even the transnational litigation that we see sometimes here, some of the stuff that's happening against Shell and so on, is hugely expensive and doesn't really provide a viable solution for the majority of issues around, for instance, climate change. There is some hope, though, I think, in some of the legislation that's coming out in Europe in relation to a company's obligations to look at their supply chain. So in the UK, you have the Modern Slavery Act. In France, you have the Droit de Vigilance. In Holland, you have a child labour law, and you have other laws on the mantle in Switzerland and Germany and so on. What that does is it requires companies to look at their supply chains, because for me, it makes an absolute nonsense for Boris Johnson to say we are going to go carbon neutral by 2050, because it's like looking at a garage in the UK without looking at the carbon footprint of a garage in the UK, without looking at the carbon footprint of the cars which are in the garage. You're not looking at the carbon footprint of mining the iron ore. and the deforestation. I was in Goa when cheap iron ore was being dug out of the ground and sent to China, which would then produce it into steel, which then went to Germany to produce cars, and the environmental degradation of digging iron ore out of the ground. You're not looking at the smelting of the iron ore. You're not looking at the creating of cars. You're not looking at the large carbon emissions in a country. It doesn't make sense unless you look at the supply chain as well. And these pieces of legislation, which I've just mentioned, if it could also be utilized to look at a company's footprint in relation to their supply chain, then I think that would be a lot better. And really then, it comes down to the consumer. The consumers in those countries, but also the consumers in these countries, to say, what is the carbon footprint of the product? What is the human rights footprint and the carbon footprint of the product which I'm buying, right? I don't want to buy this product because it doesn't have a good human rights footprint or a carbon footprint. I'm going to buy this product. And companies are only really concerned about, I'd say, 3 things. Yeah? Brand image, license to operate, and criminal prosecution of directors. They're not bothered about compensation claims, I don't think. Yeah? So if any of those are under threat, then it requires the company to move. And that's really, I think, where the pressure should be applied in relation to trying to make companies more accountable.
Can I jump in? Because with supply chains, the problem with carbon footprinting for supply chains is it's really, really complex. And we haven't even sussed it for the really high carbon industries. So cement, steel, big carbon footprints, we don't have those footprinted yet. So even your biggest areas of when a building's being built, it's very hard to be able to say this steel is lower carbon than that steel. Even if there's a factory that's selling lower carbon steel, it's very hard for the buyer to make sure that that supply chain is directly from that company, because there are so many intermediaries, and that is the way the system works. And we have a large number of very well-meaning and well-intended large corporates that you will all know, the Unilevers of the world, the M&Ss of the world, who have committed many years ago to no longer supporting any deforestation in their supply chain, and they are still unable to deliver that because they cannot track it all back, and they don't have the leverage on their supply chain that you would expect. There are these middlemen in the middle that are basically buying and then selling, and they're the ones that, for them, it's much better to keep it a black box than to open it up. So it's proving intrinsically very difficult, and having had these promises of deforestation-free supply chains for decades now, we've now got promises of net zero supply chains, and that's going to be equivalently difficult, if not worse.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say, I think, all of these are problematic. I mean, climate change isn't going to be solved by litigation. That's for sure. I think climate change will be a big area of litigation in the coming years, probably the biggest area of litigation in the coming years. But I don't think in any way means it'll be addressed by that. I think that companies can have economic leverage. We've found that. For instance, in terms of things like Assam tea, that even the threat of doing something at the moment, there's a lot of greenwashing.
You got to look this way.
Sorry. At the moment, there's a lot of greenwash, whitewashing of these things going on. But in reality, I think these companies, if there is a will, if they want to maintain their brand image as being an ethically or sustainable producer, can put pressure on their supply chains and including in relation to environmental degradations in their supply chain as well.
So you don't think that legal rulings are going to have any effect? I was going to ask you about 2 in particular, the Dutch Supreme Court ruling that has ordered the Dutch government to get its emissions or get the country's emissions down somehow. I mean, that's an order from the Dutch Supreme Court. That's one case which seems pretty significant. And the other case, which may be significant, is the UN Human Rights Committee, who ruled a couple of weeks ago that somebody can't be deported back to an uninhabitable sort of situation. So which is maybe getting towards recognition of kind of climate change refugees having rights of resettlement. So what do you think in terms of, I mean, you don't think those are significant?
I think anything that highlights the issue is helpful, and I think as lawyers we need to be much more strategic about the kind of cases that we take, because cases that we take should illustrate the wider problem. It should illustrate the wider causes of the problem and potentially the ways in which problems can be solved. And in countries like India, it really is that last mile that needs to be solved. How do you practically remedy a situation of Sundarbans losing their land, or people migrating to work in unhealthy conditions? How do you go take that last mile? It's all very well having cases which give generalized directions. So I'm slightly cynical about cases people who are taking cases to the European Court of Human Rights, for instance, on behalf of Spanish school children who are subject to forest fires because of global warming. You know, do we need any more orders saying that this is a human rights violation? We know it's a human rights violation. What we need is some way of making those things tangible to the people who are suffering. So, I mean, I'm looking at taking the case of the Sundarban Islanders in a way that would not just be a compensation case, or maybe a compensation case, but also in a way that would take the campaign forward. For one of the things that we know about, for instance, big fossil companies, is that they've lied about climate change for some time, like the asbestos companies and tobacco companies. They've hidden the truth. Now, if that could be revealed in a meaningful way through disclosure, then I think that would take the argument forward.
In the climate change world, we're certainly hanging our hope on courts being able to give some sense of impetus. That it's, you know, we saw in Madrid this last December, countries who were themselves actually on fire, Australia, United States, were literally on fire at the time of the talks, refusing to take action and trying to stop action being taken, and agreed, you know, the basic rules of how the Paris Agreement would be implemented were prevented from happening, were prevented from being agreeing, even though all the technical work had been done. And even though we had basically reached consensus, Australia, the United States, Brazil, scuppered so many little very vital bits of agreement. So we lost a whole year of technical work because of those three countries. Saudi Arabia was also behaving badly, but they always do. So we knew they would. But we were, I mean, it was literally, there was fires raging through Australia while we were watching the Australian negotiators undermine agreements in rooms. So the cognitive dissonance between what citizens are choosing when they're electing governments and what is happening globally is just too large at the moment. And we're really hoping that actions, the class actions that young people are taking, that some other groups are taking against companies but also against countries, we're really hoping that will take us forward. So I do hope that there's some progress here, because if we could get the Shells of the world, where we have good evidence that they knew about this, actually being required to start to pay, they would stop exploration. It wouldn't work for them.
Yeah. There you go, you've got your work cut out.
Yes, please.
I mean, the trouble is, I mean, those things are there, but these are, I don't know what Shell is, but these are trillion-dollar corporations, most of them. Now, unfortunately, the entire global economic system is geared to making corporations more profitable, not less profitable. So I think yes. I mean, I think compensation claims can be done. No fault compensation claims. I'm not sure about, but I think the argument must go much wider than that.
I mean, I was reading in the press the last couple of weeks, and it seems there's sort of $1 trillion of new investment in fossil fuels.
Yeah.
And a lot in Africa, announced by Boris Johnson, I think.
It was.
Last week at the Africa Summit. Massive investment in fossil fuels. But at the same time, the green technologies at the moment seem to rely on minerals where there is an incredibly high level of exploitation, child labour, all of the abuses you were talking about. So, which makes me kind of despair. I mean, and I suppose that then raises the question, is there any such thing as a kind of ethical capitalism? But maybe we shouldn't go there. No, I don't know.
Well,
Are there any grounds for optimism, I suppose?
It's been an incredibly bad couple of weeks on the climate change world, I have to say. I mean, Boris's speech was at the African Investment Summit was meant to be a green speech. We'd been encouraged to cover it, and we were all ready with all sorts of different lines we might take, depending on what he actually said. But we were not ready with a line that basically was, we're going to cut coal, because actually the UK government has raised the bar so high on investment in coal, even under their export credit system, that there hasn't been any coal investment for, well, I was in government, I was a civil servant at the time that was agreed, and I think it was about 8 years ago. I can't quite remember now. But that was agreed a long time ago. There hasn't been any investment since the bar was put so high. Oil and gas, no, that's still okay. And it's not okay. There are solutions. You can. A lot of the countries in Africa have hydro, and you need to run your hydro in a different way. It needs to be slightly rehabilitated. But those existing hydro can actually play the role that everyone says gas has to play. They keep saying, oh, you need gas. You don't need gas. You've got other solutions. There are batteries, and there's hydro, and there's all sorts of solutions out there. The issue about the minerals and the production of minerals, well, this, again, has to be something that we really pressure the mining companies on. There is... The right to operate is, as you were saying, one of the biggest issues for these large corporations. And we have to make it a Nike issue. When people objected to Nike using child labour in their factories, Nike stopped using child labour in their factories. It's that simple. The problem with mining companies is they're so distant from us. And we need to be able to get lines of sight to where the companies that we buy stuff from are getting their original products from. And there is progress on that. There's a website that's been developed in the UK, actually, in one of the northern universities. I think it's Lancaster, I can't remember which. It's called Trace. And basically it allows companies to begin to see where their original products come from. And at the moment it's mostly focused on the sort of mining industry and the forestry industry. And it's trying to give the companies that buy products in the UK a line of sight to actually where that originally came from, so they can say with hand on heart, no human rights abuses where we sourced our materials. But until we get that being demanded by consumers, we'll be moving too slowly. We do have to move on that, but we can also solve many of the energy and transport issues.
Yeah, I mean, I think there needs to be joined up thinking. It doesn't make sense to talk about electric cars in this country when they're being produced in other countries where there's pollution, or the electricity comes from countries where there's pollution. I mean, like for instance, India is investing quite a lot in renewables, but it's also investing a lot in coal, cheap coal. In some of the work that I do is in Chhattisgarh, one of the Indian states, where there's all of these thermal power stations being built. And the irony is that the local communities, are not living unelectrified villages, And some of that, so in one case, Adani power plant in the state of Jharkhand, which is an Indian state, the coal comes from Australia, the power station is in Jharkhand, and the electricity is wholly exported to Bangladesh. So all the local people get is pollution, right? So there has to be some joined-up thinking about the global economy in which we live, rather than just talking about nation states. And yeah, I mean, and in relation to supply chains. So, in answer to your question, is there a ethical capitalism? Probably not. But there can be a more sustainable capitalism, and this is what, if we're going to make any progress, we have to say to large companies is, look, we're not talking to be nice. It's not about being nice as a company. It's about being sustainable. You know, at the end of the day, you're biting the hand that feeds you. If you're biting the communities in which you work, you're the workers, you're not going to be able to be in this industry for the long term. You may make short-term profit or medium-term profits, but ultimately, isn't it the case that you want to be in an industry for a length of time and make sustainable profits? And yes, actually, you may actually do good in your business activity. And don't you want to go die on your deathbed thinking, actually, I did some good, rather than think I just made some money for some shareholders? So I think that's you know, the pressure, and that pressure will only come. I think at present, maybe 10% of the British population care about the provenance of the good they buy. Maybe not even 10%, right? We have to make sure it's 50%. People are becoming vegan, right? They're making that choice to become vegan, partly out of environmental reasons and ethical reasons. We have to translate that make people translate that to goods they buy. And when you have 50% of the people who say, well, I want to know where this good comes from and how it's produced, and is it produced in places that respect human rights or are trying to respect human rights, then I think we're making progress.
Yes, but also when the people in the rich world start seeing migration as an issue of justice, I've probably mentioned before, there's a book called The Right to Stay Home, which is about migration. And it's actually about Mexico and the United States and the environmental degradation in Mexico through mining corporations, mega farms, things like that, which actually force people to leave their homes in Mexico and go and work in the States. And of course, they have to go illegally and all that implies. So, and I started off with my questions talking about the Vietnamese migrants. So I think it's very, very important that we begin to understand migration in those terms, in terms of justice to those people who've been forced out of their homes. At the moment, UNHCR takes the view that climate change, there's no such thing as a climate change refugee, that climate change is a sort of a natural disaster which doesn't discriminate, and that therefore, because the definition of a refugee is somebody who is outside their own country and unwilling to return owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted on grounds of race, religion, nationality, particular social group or political opinion, that natural disasters and climate change are the epitome of a non-discriminatory sort of disaster. So at the moment, UNHCR's position, which is interesting because the Climate Change Committee is batting off the whole thing about resettlement, saying, no, that's for UNHCR. UNHCR is saying, no, it's nothing to do with us because they're not refugees in terms of the convention. I have come across some academic studies which are arguing that that climate change refugees should be recognised as refugees, in that they are suffering from a discriminatory lack of protection from their home state. I mean, you only have to think of what you've been talking about, the situation in the Sundarbans. Possibly Hurricane Katrina is another classic example of a discriminatory lack of protection, although I don't know how the rest of the world would have responded to an influx of poor refugees from New Orleans. But yeah, I was just going to ask you finally about that sort of relationship and what the prospects are for recognition of the rights of people who've been forced to move by climate change.
Well, I don't know how whether there's any movement in that. I mean, I certainly think it's absolutely necessary. It's a fundamental justice issue, as you say, caused by not a natural act, but a totally unnatural act. And obviously the ironic thing is that, for instance, in the context of these Sundarban Islanders, when I went 12 years ago now, they didn't even have any electricity. So their carbon footprint was zip, right? They have made no contribution to the problems which they now face. And you know, international law is, you know, quite often very difficult to get. But if international law is going to mean anything, then there has to be a humanitarian response with this, either in the already existing auspices of the Refugee Convention, so you redefine the Refugee Convention, or in a separate multilateral treaty. But in some way, I think this needs to be recognised and enforced.
One of the opportunities would be, through the loss and damage dialogue, to move to a conversation around supporting the mobility of people that then got picked up other parts of the multilateral system. The problem is our multilateral system is strongly under threat at the moment. It's, you know, the sort of reversal post-Paris agreement, where we had a multilateral agreement, to what happened in Madrid is you're really seeing the evidence of the impact of the games that Trump's team were playing, the Bolsonaro and the Australians. But there is a recognition that this is a growing problem, and it's not just a problem of international migration, it's a problem of internal migration. And that, in some ways, is one of the areas where we really have to push for, at least within countries, that we're supporting the mobility. But the Internal Displacement Monitoring Centre reckoned that 17.2 million people moved last year because of climate impacts, and they largely moved within their countries. But that sort of level is higher than we've seen before. The World Bank has estimated that 150 million will be moved internally just from 3 regions over the next couple of decades. This is, you know, in our current moment. And we're already seeing Uganda holding huge numbers of refugees from other countries in their neighbourhood. And the UN are trying to put an estimate on it of somewhere between 25 million and 1 billion between now and 2050. And there's a huge range there, and part of it is because it's so hard to track. But the reality is, as we're beginning to see more and more people becoming more mobile, and as we begin to see more refugee camps, whether it's internally displaced or moving across borders, I think the sense that this is an issue of great import has increased. Now, we've seen in the Sahel a big investment coming suddenly into Sahelian countries, which were traditionally donor orphans, they're called. They get less aid support than other countries. We're suddenly seeing a big surge, but it's going to the wrong sorts of things. It's going to those big agricultural projects that actually displace people and don't work with the grain, don't work with, actually, pastoralists have very climate resilient livelihood. They work with the variability of their region. So if we were supporting people to be mobile in ways that work with their livelihoods, we wouldn't be seeing so much distress migration, and that's what you call refugees. So it's this need to really change the whole development discourse and to change it fairly rapidly, and also to encourage the governments in the regions that will be moving, South Asia, Africa being two of the most mobile, to support people moving in ways that work within the country as well, because it's desperation that take them to places they don't have friends or family. It's desperation that takes them to take longer journeys. If we can support them to move more in the regions, they're actually going to be thriving faster. So there's all sorts of things that could be done if only we could change the way we do development so that it's more climate responsive.
Thank you. Right, questions? I'm sure other people have got things that they would like to ask.
Is there any hope that change could come in the UN? Because if the different sections of the UN aren't speaking to each other, if some countries have got a veto, if some countries think it's belong, some countries think it's no good, is there any hope there?
Is that to me? Well, I can start anyway. I mean, I guess everything hangs slightly in my mind at the moment on Trump and whether he gets re-elected. There's a sense that the UN system is really under threat. They're also, you know, the UN is not a perfect body by any means, and different parts of the UN are trying to act on behalf of governments instead of acting as an honest broker. So there are all sorts of problems with the UN system, and it's not perfect. The UNFCCC process is evident of how intrinsically countries are gaming the system in order to get what they want out of a multilateral agreement. And if we get Trump re-elected, if Boris continues to make stupid announcements when he's meant to be the COP president in this coming year, we may well see the collapse of the Paris Agreement. If we see the collapse of the Paris Agreement, we're back to scratch. And there isn't really any real sense of opportunity or hope at that point. So there are two really important things at the moment. Boris gets his act together and Trump doesn't get re-elected.
Just on that UN question. I mean, yeah, that's Claire's obviously talked about the climate change issue, but I mean, there are other related movements that are taking place in the UN, one of which is a movement on business and human rights. So, as you all know, human rights was not a word that was in the discourse of businesses up until fairly recently, and then we saw horrific human rights violations by businesses, for instance, the Bhopal gas tragedy in 1984 and so on. And there has been a move to make businesses more understanding and conformity with human rights. And one of the things that's taking place in the UN at the moment is a movement to make a binding treaty on business and human rights, which will make countries, because it's only states which are bound by treaties, countries to make their own corporations, domicile corporations, more accountable for their human rights practice. And that, as I said, is being reflected in domestic legislation around Europe and Australia, and Tobago was the first country to produce that. So that is happening, and that's moving forward. And unfortunately, obviously, the UK is out of the EU now, but in the European Union, Brussels is also pushing this quite a bit as well. And I think that, if it takes place, would be a step forward, because ultimately, if you make corporations more accountable, then you can also make them more accountable for their climate change emissions and so on.
Thanks.
Would that be retrospective, may I ask?
The binding treaty, it's being negotiated at the moment. Ecuador is the country that's proposed it, so I don't know. I'm sorry, I'm not really upon the latest negotiations, but unlikely, because most legislation isn't retrospective.
I wanted to make an observation and then also lead on to a question if I can. The observation, I don't think I'm the only one in the room who worked at Oxfam for a while, but I did, and I had the privilege, I will say it was that, I went out to the Philippines, and I went to the area around Mount Pinatubo, which had only 5 years earlier, I think it was, that had a major volcanic eruption. It was it was a terrible situation. And I was struck by what Claire said about cultural issues that affect migration. Because my first perception going to the area around Mount Pinatubo is, why aren't these people moving? This is a dangerous place. Because this volcano could erupt again, it was stricken by the flooding, devastation. And then I began to realise that moving is not such a simple task. The cultural aspects of association with a region, language, ancestral commitments, family links, so many things that rooted people in that area. And therefore, this is, I hope, going to lead on to my question. I wondered if, in a world now where social media, so the power of the mobile phone, different technologies that are around, is that maybe there are solutions that are much closer to home in countries that are facing climate catastrophe. Migration doesn't have to be the answer, because culturally it would be very hard for people to move en masse. And maybe there are solutions that perhaps social media and other sort of modern technologies will suddenly open up. Do you see any signs that things might improve at a local level without necessitating huge migratory flows?
Technology is not neutral. It can be great, it can have very negative impacts. So in a location where sea level rise is happening and you're seeing storm surges happening and your aquifer is becoming saline, you're going to have to move. You're just going to have to. And how they can be supported to do that in ways, I mean, the language in the climate change world is mobility with dignity. The idea that, they're choosing where they're going and how it's going to work. And that where they arrive is somewhere where they can build a new cultural home. But there are other locations where, the livelihood might not be the same, but there are opportunities. And technology has advantages. There are, possibilities of tracking how the corporates are behaving, for example, building systems where smallholder agriculturalists can better access supply chain finance from the big corporates and get investment into a more resilient production system. But there are many issues about how technology, one of the biggest problems with technology solutions at the moment is that they're generally young white men in cities in different places, but sometimes they're young men of their location, Africans, Asians, but they are a very small, narrow group of very educated individuals who are coming up with new technologies, new apps, new ideas, and they're not very close to the people who have the problem. So building a dialogue and getting them to understand the risks of, if you open up a system entirely, you can make it more punitive on the poorest, most vulnerable communities that have no rights already. So you've got to make sure that the way you build a system where the poorest are getting access somehow to new climate information or new products or new services, that it's done in a way that gives them power, doesn't further disempower them. And what we're seeing, there's a lot of hackathons, they're called, within the climate change world, which are bringing together bright young things to come up with great new digital tech solutions for the climate challenge. But they all tend to be a solution without understanding what the challenge is in the first place. So we've got to bring those two worlds together. We've got to do it in a way where the governance and the rights of people are privileged rather than undermined in the process. So it's something that I have colleagues of mine working on. We're fascinated by this area, thinking about how blockchain, for example, could make sure that finance actually gets to where it should go, but at the same time do so in a way where the governance system. So one of the opportunities could be, for example, people that are are given rights again over land that they didn't have rights over, restoring the ecology, getting payments from companies for offsets of the carbon stored in that location, how that can be done in a way where it's not actually a policing satellite that that doesn't understand actually how that local area, the community actually manage that land. So they think it's a bad thing when actually it's a good thing. So I'm not sure I'm being very clear, sorry, it's been a really long week, but there's a lot of very big issues to look at in this area.
I think having worked in India for some time, one of the most inspiring things is to see communities and indigenous people in India, we call them Adivasis, tribals, resisting the onslaught of corporations and their dictates. Because I think ultimately climate change is not just about carbon emissions. It's actually about challenging the culture of waste and destruction, and the idea that everything has to be measured in terms of gross domestic product and capital accumulation and so on. And what inspired me is that these people have an alternative discourse, and I'll give you an example of that. A few years ago, you may know that in eastern India, in the Indian state of Odisha, there was a British mining company that wanted to mine a mountain for very good quality bauxite, a company called Vedanta Resources PLC. The mountain was called Niyamgiri Raja. Raja means king in Hindi. It was a sacred mountain that was worshipped by the local Dongria Khand tribe. And there was only maybe a few hundred of them, but through their own campaigning and through an international campaign, so for instance, Survival International came to London and gave out leaflets in front of St. Paul saying, St. Paul's is going to be knocked down tomorrow. People were like, oh my God, that's horrific. And well, that's exactly what this British company is attempting to do in Orissa, right? And through that campaign, they've managed to stop that. And that's I think where the hope lies. So when you're asking Tony about the question about, is migration the answer? No, migration's not the answer. The answer is supporting these communities that are fighting against unbridled capitalist accumulation and destruction of the environment. That's the answer, and we hope that we can, mitigate some of the damage that climate change, that this type of economic system is causing, and then we can also talk about adapting to the damage that's already been done.
Thank you.
I mentioned Boris Johnson, and it's a great opportunity, and I'm sure people are explaining to him that a great opportunity to become a major player on the world stage, not just the European stage, but the world stage, and leave a lasting legacy for decades to come by going to the COP in Glasgow and setting out how his government's got a credible plan. His father, his sister and brother, his girlfriend even are environmentalists. They must be explaining this to him. We've seen little evidence that it's making much penetration to him. What's your assessment about whether that approach might be successful? Because it would seem that he could get a lot of personal credibility from it, which might be a way of levering his position.
Well, that was definitely why they chose to go for being the COP president, this was a moment to wash their face post-Brexit and be seen as a good thing again. They're not done very well over the last couple of weeks. And working with the least developed countries, they knew that there was going to be this big week, this week, with Boris starting the COP presidency. The gun was pulled for the start of the year on Tuesday. We all knew that was happening, and we planned this week of climate diplomacy around Europe with our least developed countries group. And Bhutan's, who's the chair of the least developed country, they're not allowed to travel because of coronavirus. Their government decided on Monday. And then on Tuesday happened, and they said, well, maybe we don't need to come anyway. I mean, what's going to happen? Because what he said on Tuesday was so vacuous and empty of content of any sort at all that matters to people. The least developed countries have been told many times by the UK government, you're really important to pulling COP26 off. We really want to hear from you. You know, come immediately that we start our year and we'll have these conversations. And we don't have any Bhutanese government representatives coming. They're coming to Ireland to do the start of what was meant to be a trip. Ireland, the UK, and then Holland. After they've seen the Irish government, they're going home. They can't be bothered to come to London, and they're not going to the Holland conversation either, because they, why bother? So it's not a good start to the week, to the year. Sorry, this week is the start of the year, and it hasn't been a good first couple of days. The fact that just before the big announcement of their strategy on Tuesday by Boris, he sacked his COP president. And to be honest, she wasn't particularly popular, neither by the British civil servants nor internationally by the people that were dealing with her. She was okay, she was enthusiastic, but she wasn't particularly brilliant. She clearly didn't grasp the issues herself. But we're without a president right now, and we've just started the process of the negotiations. So I have to say, this is why I'm a little bit down, I have to say, this week. It hasn't been a good week for me and for my colleagues. We still have an Ethiopian representative coming to London, and he will represent the LDC group, but the chair has decided not to have a representative present. So they've got somebody coming all the way from New York for the Dublin 2 days, but not coming for London's 2 days, and not going to The Hague on Friday.
I think the problem is that this government is contemptuous of international obligations. The ICJ, the International Court of Justice, ruled against Britain in terms of the Chagos Islands a few months ago. That decision has not been implemented, right? Even though the UK has declared that they will follow decisions of the International Court of Justice, that decision to return the Chagos Islands to the people who have been displaced because of the military presence there has not been implemented by the British government. This government does not care about international law at all. Now, if they don't care about the ICJ ruling, what are they going to care about negotiations in terms of climate change? And unfortunately, Boris Johnson history, with his close relationship with countries that are dismantling environmental regulations at a rapid rate isn't very good either. So we look at love-ins between Boris Johnson and Narendra Modi, who's the Prime Minister of India. Narendra Modi has been dismantling environmental regulations at a rapid rate. The National Green Tribunal, one of the few environmental courts that was set up anywhere in the world to challenge environmental decisions, has been under-resourced, has not been functioning in 4 of the benches around India. So this is Boris Johnson's view on international law, and what Boris Johnson thinks of other people who are also dismantling environmental regulations. He's no friend of the environment.
Right, we've got time for 2 or 3 more questions, so you had your hand up, I think.
Thank you. I'm very struck this evening. We started by pointing out that the climate crisis was upon us already, and it's a current issue, and people on the ground, as it were, are already suffering. And then the conversation has rather moved on to talking about the role of courts and corporations, etc., and mitigation for the future stuff. Meanwhile, these people on the ground, the poorest people in the poorest countries quite often are the ones who are dealing with today's consequences of climate change, as there will be in 10 years' time, etc. And I think it's quite interesting how we've done what the world is doing, which is saying, oh yes, that's a problem now, but actually let's talk about these things that really aren't going to make a difference for an awful long time. Suspects. I was very struck by some of the words that we used, because I used to work in provision of sanitation and water supply in developing countries, and actually it just struck me as that they're just exactly the same issues, And the real problem, to my knowledge, never overcome in that area was the lack of political will locally to address the fact that there's plenty of money. Technical solutions are there to provide everybody with sanitation, etc., etc. And I would argue that a lot of the technical solutions are here to help the people on the ground today who are suffering from climate change issues. And I wonder whether the discussion about what everyone was saying to the sort of higher level stuff isn't rather letting local governments off the hook, or national governments off the hook, to not address how they are going to ameliorate the situation for their poorest people, etc. And I don't know whether I'm just barking up the wrong tree or whether this is something that you're finding, that it's the lack of political will locally that can actually sometimes be the biggest barrier to doing something as opposed to talking about it.
So, I mean, yes, there are huge issues within the poorest countries in the world, and the poorest communities in those poorest countries very often have very little access to any sort of support from governments. And these governments are not neutral, they're political, they've got a lot of their own challenges, they've got corruption, they've got elite capture, they've got all those bad things. But actually in the climate change world, they're kind of different, and they like that. They're the good guys. They didn't cause any of this. This is their problem to deal with. It was caused by us. And that is, in some ways, in some countries, a route to a different way of working with those governments that you don't have in the normal development world, because they are seeing themselves as needing to act fast, act rapidly, and act in deep ways that will reach their communities. So having worked on sort of broad development and, prior to, I was working with a lot of UK funding for much of my life and acted as a UK civil servant for 15 years. And during that, most of that time, I didn't talk about climate change. I was working on long-term environmental degradation and the issues of climate impacts, climate variability, but we weren't calling it climate change. As soon as you start talking about climate change, it actually changes the narrative you have with those governments. And we now have an initiative at the least developed countries called LIFE-AR, the LDC Initiative for Effective Adaptation and Resilience. And in that, one of the principles that they have put on the table and required the donors that are signing a compact with them is that 70% of all climate finance should reach the local level and be invested behind their local communities' priorities. So they're not, they have actually they've set out a level of transparency and accountability that you wouldn't necessarily be able to negotiate in a wash deal with a government. So there is a different way of working when you're working on climate change, but you are still dealing with the underlying politics, the underlying development challenges, and the underlying lack of capacity at local government level, or the lack of budget arriving at local government level. So I'm not going to say this is solving anything, but I do think the discourse is different, and you can have a much more ambitious discussion about what a government wants to do to protect themselves and protect their communities from the impacts of climate change.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I was to say, what do you think of climate change to the majority of communities that I work with, they'd just A, look completely puzzled, and B, it would come down number 35 in their priority of things they're concerned with. In places where there's not access to in central India, in the village where I work, if you get cancer, you have to travel 18 hours by train to go to a hospital in Mumbai. Now, the effects of climate change isn't going to be very top of their priority. And then you're faced, obviously, with issues of corruption. So having slagged off compensation claims, having worked in areas like this for the last 10 years, you're putting a significant amount of money by local standards into the area. What are people concerned about? People are concerned about putting money into their own pocket, right? Now, how do you get past that, right? You get past that by trying to do things that are creative. So you say, look, we're no longer going to try and reimburse people on an individual level, because we're not seeing any uplifting of the local community. We're not seeing any strategic thought about how a community can, for instance, protect itself against climate change. So what do we do? Well, we form a community trust. We get local people involved in making decisions. And in fact, actually, there's a lot to be learned from some of the examples of how local decision making can work in a lot of these countries. India, as you know, for instance, has the amazing system of village councils, panchayats and gram sabhas, yeah, groups of villagers making decisions. That's how Indian democracy existed for centuries, yeah, a proper way of discussing. Now you mobilize them, you educate them, you upskill them, and I think you can make progress in terms of trying to address these issues on the ground.
Right, I'm very conscious that it's after 9 and people are probably desperate to get home. I'm sure you are, Claire. So I think that we should wrap up now and thank our speakers hugely for such an informative